Hey everyone, we're starting out a little darker tonight. A period of penalties, pottage, and plagues. We're going to explore the realities of medieval existence. Hollywood sold you castles and chivalry, but forget that. In all honesty, you most likely wouldn't survive a day. Please, take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me where you're tuning in from in the comments section, as well as the time for you. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Now turn down the lights and, if you like that gentle background hum, turn on a fan. And let's take it slow as we embark on our journey tonight. You've just woken up in the year 1325, congratulations. Fortunately, you are still alive. The fleas are also the bad news. Because it was a barn floor 3 months ago, your bed is a half-rotted straw mattress that is full of hay and bugs and has a barn floor odor. Memory foam, pillows, and Egyptian cotton linens are all absent. It's just a wool blanket that hasn't been cleaned since last winter and has accumulated so much dirt that it weighs about a small cow. The distant sound of the church bell wakes you up. It's like an alarm clock from the Middle Ages, only louder and somehow less forgiving. Your home is a one-room, windowless wooden hut with a lovely open-concept layout where your family, pets, and household insects all live together. Oh, what a lovely symphony the smell is. A delicate mixture of goat, human perspiration, stale beer, and something you hope isn't mold, but that's probably not in your soul. There is no such thing as scented candles. They simply melt on your dirt floor, even if they were. You quickly regret stretching since your joints hurt and the air is chilly. You are 22 years old, which is about middle-aged in medieval terms. Your knees sound like a bag of rocks being shaken by a bewildered peasant, and your spine creaks like an old wooden door. It's risky to get out of bed. The floor is either crusty from whatever your neighbor's chicken did or damp from the rain from last night, which seeps through the thatched roof. In any case, the ecology now includes your bare feet. And privacy, too. What is that? Your whole family is waking up next to you, along with perhaps a stray relative who has never left. Everything is common. There is no bedroom, no curtains, and no time for oneself. You're never really alone in medieval Europe because you're always accompanied by rats, parasites, and 8 other individuals. And that's how your day begins. From here, it only gets worse. It appears that you have successfully escaped your medieval nightmare. Well done. Nature is calling now. Furthermore, it's hardly a courteous call. It's yelling. This is where you begin to miss the contemporary bathroom. No toilet, seat, toilet paper, flush, or even a somewhat bitter plunger in the corner are present. In the 14th century, getting rid of oneself is a social experiment, an adventure, and frequently a minor public gathering. A wooden bucket behind the house is probably your bathroom if you're a peasant, and it's already full because Uncle Wolf Stan had a horrible night after eating rotten turnips. The odor is biblical. After holding your breath and taking care of your business, the worst part comes. Throw it out onto the road. The street, indeed. Before throwing it out the window, you should yell something like "Garde-loup." It means "watch out below" in Old French. But to be honest, nobody ever moves quickly enough. In medieval towns, the streets are like open sewers, a picturesque river of animal feces, human waste, and mysterious substances you don't want to look at. Congratulations if you're fortunate enough to reside in a town with public restrooms. In an outhouse where ventilation is a cruel joke and privacy is a myth, you get to sit next to strangers. You may engage in short discussion, but avoid taking heavy breaths. I've never heard of toilet paper. The majority of people use straw, leaves, rags, moss, or, if they're feeling particularly decadent, a piece of wool to wipe. Nothing at all sometimes, which could account for the lack of popularity of handshakes at the time. And it must be nicer if you're in a castle, right? Sort of. A hole in the wall that plunges your waist straight into the moat may be your guard-robe. Excellent plan, but your adversaries are aware of it. Indeed, there were occasions when assailants entered by the waist shot. Bring up the idea of going in the back door. Therefore, using the loo in the Middle Ages is a humiliating custom for both farmers and barons. It's risky, it's cold, it's in the open, and it's always unpleasant. You will be face first among humanity's leftovers with just one slip on a wet stone road. We'll talk about that later. You haven't washed your teeth yet. You made it through the loo. You should be rewarded, don't you? A good breakfast, perhaps. Something cozy, tasty, and warm. Apologies, this is Europe in the Middle Ages. This place isn't reassuring. Breakfast is a somber affair, if you can call it that. Benedict, there are no eggs, no avocado toast, and no coffee makers spluttering awake. Near the fire, you crouch or sit down next to a wooden dish filled with what appears to have been scraped off a dirty boot. Welcome to your pottage ration for the day. Anything you can find can be used to make pottage, a thick, gooey stew. Root vegetables, grains, and, if you're lucky, a few beans. New ingredients are simply added on top of the ones that have been cooking in the same pot for days or even weeks. It's more of a continuous gastronomic experiment than a recipe. A piece of bread so firm it could deflect arrows was on the side. Because wheat is a rich man's dream, it is produced from coarse rye or barley flour and frequently bulked up with sawdust, mashed up acorns, or other inventive material. You're not going to like this loaf. You don't cut it, you bargain with it. How about beverages? You're not drinking an oat milk latte or orange juice. You're sipping beer. Beer, indeed. 6:00 a.m. Why? Because the water is rife with dirt and parasites. With weak ale, little alcohol, and high survival, you begin your day. Children also consume it. At least it won't kill you right away, even though nobody is happy about it. Do you want cheese or meat? Keep dreaming. Only if your Lord is feeling very giving will you do that on Sundays and saints' feast days. The majority of peasants only occasionally consume meat. Don't even consider spices unless you're royalty, and only use fresh fruit when it's in season and hasn't already fermented into wine. The price of a pinch of pepper exceeds your monthly salary. You guzzle your medieval beer, chew your rough bread, and try not to think about the rat that might have eaten your porridge in the middle of the night, because salt is important enough to be stored away. You are not energized by breakfast. You simply experience it. It's time to work like your life relies on it, because it really does, now that you're suitably underfed. After finishing your depressing medieval breakfast, it's time to put on your clothes. It won't do any good. There is only one clothing in your closet. One. You've been wearing the same linen shift or rough wool tunic every day for months, if not years. The concept of seasonal fashion does not exist. Simply wear this till it breaks down or infects you with fungus. Pants is not required. Maybe a linen under tunic if you're lucky. If not, you're going a commando under layers of hot, scratchy wool that were painstakingly sewn together by someone who most likely didn't know what a seam should look like. Additionally, there isn't a washing machine, soap, or dry cleaner anywhere to be found. Your clothing smell like a pile of compost that has been marinated in a pigsty. And they are also discolored, stiff, and odorous. It's difficult to wash them, even if you wanted to. You would have to carry water from a river or, well, heat it over a fire. Wash your tunic with ashes or lie down, and then hang it in the sun, which is out about 3 days a year. And let's not even talk about shoes. If you have any, they are as arch-supporting as a banana peel, are made of untreated leather, and are hardly put together. The majority of peasants simply walk barefoot through medieval landmines, which are sharp rocks and disease ponds, mud and excrement. All of this points to one conclusion. Your skin despises you. You scratch all the time. Bed bugs, lice, and fleas all reside on your body. Everybody has them. walking insect farms, itching kids, squalid monks, and lords. Nobody gets away. While conversing with a local priest, you will be using a wooden spoon to itch your armpit, and nobody will give a shay to eat. Rubbing has left your skin raw. The battlefield of bites is your scalp. And it's too bad if you get a rash. No hydrocortisone, no dermatologist, and no one to warn you that it's most likely scabies. You simply continue to suffer, and it's fantastic if you're fortunate enough to avoid infection. For the next 6 months, that rash will just be with you like an unwanted medieval sidekick. It's time to go outdoors and begin working yourself to death now that you're covered in discomfort and wearing a miserable outfit. It's time to show off your morning grin now that you're completely covered in itches and wet wool. You don't, though, because it was risky to smile during the Middle Ages. Dentally, not emotionally. There isn't any floss, mouthwash, toothpaste, or toothbrush. As far as oral hygiene is concerned, it is as popular as taking a bath. For the most part, your teeth are on their own and not doing well, though some people may chew on a twig or rinse with vinegar or wine. When you reach your mid-20s, your smile appears to have been lifted from a haunted crypt. Cavities are common, gums swell, and those stains on your teeth aren't just from food. Decomposition is that. You're more rotten than a root vendor from the Middle Ages. Although it's not yet widely available, sugar is growing more popular among wealthy people. Usually used in little cakes or to flaunt affluence, this expensive import is imported. Congrats if you're a nobleman. Compared to the peasants, you get to ruin your teeth more quickly. If you are impoverished, you will gradually overcome it through years of hard chewing, sour bread, and gritty porridge. Become accustomed to toothaches. They are constantly present in the background, much like the weather of the Middle Ages. The kind of pain that makes you want to use a pair of pliers to yank out your own teeth, pray, or drink. It's not a joke either. The real treatment was that. Barber surgeons existed, but dentists did not. Indeed, the same guy who cuts your hair is also taking your MERS out by candlelight with an iron hook and zero anesthesia. Dental infection. I hope you enjoy fevers, because in the absence of antibiotics, a toothache could quickly develop into sepsis and cause your death. Yes, exactly. Your funeral in the 1300s might be the same thing that makes us visit a pharmacist now. On the social front, there is also no respite. Good luck, kissing. There is terrible breath, or halitosis, everywhere. You're not evaluated by your smile if you're single. Your livestock and your land are used to judge you. Your mouth is a battlefield, to put it briefly. It's losing the war, too. Let's go outside now that your teeth are aching, because you're just beginning your actual job, the one that will break your back. It's time to leave for work. However, there is no desk, no office, no coffee break, and no opportunity for advancement. If you're like 90% of the people, your work is easy. Don't sacrifice your life for the comfort of others. You're a commoner. Well done. In other words, you labor on property owned by a lord who most likely forgets your name. The sun rises with you, and you only stop when it passes behind the trees. A rusty sickle, a wooden hoe, your tools, and whatever bones you still have. No weekend exists. No clocking out is allowed. 6 days a week, from sunrise to sunset, is all that exists. If you're not harvesting, fending off raiders, or fervently hoping that your infected toe won't turn black. Sunday is off. It's a harsh job. Fields are plowed by hand, or, if you can afford them, by oxen. You carry water, dig ditches, pick weeds, and stitch seeds until your spine starts to look like the letter S. It doesn't matter if you're exhausted. Nobody is inquiring about your mental health. Surprise if you're a lady. You perform more than just field work. You take care of kids too. Pretend that your husband's lice infestation isn't slowly spreading to your side of the bed while you clean, cook, spin wool, and feed the animals. Children begin to assist at the age of 5. Just a small wooden rake no education, no toys, and the hope that one day they won't die of the flu. If you're one of the few people who don't work as a farmer, it's fantastic if you're a cooper, tanner, or blacksmith. You still spend your days in ill-ventilated barns handling fire, chemicals, or animal intestines. Basically, the pay is survival. The benefits, sporadic bleeding, bone break, etc. Take a warm beer, get a fever, and continue. Even for a day, you cannot afford to stop, because you don't eat if you're not working. If you don't eat, there's a remedy for it in medieval Europe. It's known as replacement. You take hold of your shovel, disregard the blisters, and continue digging, because your job wasn't a career in the Middle Ages. It is a test of endurance in slow motion. Let's discuss the weather now that your back is burning from working in the fields. Because in the Middle Ages, temperature was more about constant punishment from the sky than it was about the seasons. First, let's talk about winter. Weathering, central heating, and insulation are all absent. A chicken might be thrown through the cracks in the wooden barriers. Instead of glass, your windows are covered with cloth. The hearth fire is lovely in theory, but you don't have enough firewood to keep it going because wood is costly, and sometimes it's against the law to harvest it from the forest. Yes, if you pick up the wrong stick from the wrong forest, you could be put to death. You cling close to the dwindling embers, bundle up in your one wet wool tunic, and still wake up with your nose freezing. Your feet are always cold and frequently wet. Your tense fingers feel like little medieval popsicles. There is no diagnosis for frostbite. It's simply referred to as bad luck. Now let's move on to summer. It sounds better, doesn't it? False. Your house becomes a clay oven during the summer. No cross breeze, no fan, and no deodorant at all. You perspire through your clothing, yet you are unable to take them off because exposing too much skin is frowned upon and increases the risk of sunburn, insect bites, and social rejection. The fragrance of last week's goat stew, which is still fermenting in the corner, and your unclean body are drawing a lot of flies. While you sleep, mosquitoes buzz near your ear, assuming you can sleep over the noise of crying infants and shouting neighbors. The sun drenches you on the fields. No hat or sunscreen, unless you made one like a desperate scarecrow out of straw. You still have to work, which is the worst thing. Taking a bad turn is another name for heat stroke. You're either sweating through your lone pair of socks and your thighs are chafing into oblivion, or you're shivering in your own hole and wondering whether your toes will survive till spring. And the one constant is that your next job is still waiting, your food is still awful, and your clothes still itch no matter the season. Welcome to medieval-style climate control. Not at all. Are you thirsty? Do you need to freshen up? Do you want to wake up from this dream of a life of wet fever by splattering some water on your face? Unfortunately, you don't want to be near water in the Middle Ages. It is silently attempting to kill you. Let's have a drink first. The neighboring stream appears clean, bubbling, and new, like something from a science fiction film. But it's not. Spoiler alert. Someone simply threw a chamber pot into it upstream. A dead pig is most likely decaying in there if that isn't the case. Every sip contains bacteria, parasites, and the whole medieval European microbial army. People drank beer for that reason. Yes, even kids drink alcohol. It was little beer, weak in alcohol, strong in survival, so don't envision medieval kids attempting keg stands. The water was safer than whatever ran down the town ditch since brewing boiled it. If you were wealthy and didn't care about getting your work done by noon, you could also buy wine. How about taking a bath? Water was undoubtedly utilized to clean. Yes, in principle. Not at all in reality. You see, back then, people thought that taking a bath really caused your pores to open, allowing the sickness to enter. Yes, exactly. Self-washing was regarded as a medical danger. It seems that if you never cleaned the protective layer of dirt that was deposited on your skin, you were cleaner. There were communal baths, but they soon became known for being hotbeds of scandal, gossip, and occasionally extreme medieval extracurriculars. Naturally, the church became involved and closed several of them. It was a complete production, even if you wanted to take a bath. You would have to fill a wooden tub that was leaking, collect water from the well, boil it over a fire, and then hope that no one else in the house used it before you, or worse, after you. Additionally, rainwater is gathered in open barrels where moss grows, insects reproduce, and birds poop. Doesn't that sound refreshing? Water in the Middle Ages is therefore less of a life source and more of a risk, whether it is getting into your mouth, on your body, or on your crops. You'll be sweating in a straw bed, gripping your stomach and thinking back on all of your life's decisions if you take one wrong gulp. Raise a glass for our forefathers the next time you drink tap water. You drank the water since they didn't have the luxury of staying hydrated without risk. Or perhaps you did not. Perhaps you just bumped into a disappointment-shaped rock. In any case, you're ill. You require assistance. A doctor is necessary for you. Unfortunately, you live in the Middle Ages, when a medical degree is essentially just polite torture. First, let's discuss the diagnosis. Your humors are out of harmony, which is the root of everything that is wrong with you, including a cough, rash, shattered bone, and the creeping plague. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were the four humors. Medieval science says that maintaining their equilibrium, like an internal soup, is essential to your health. Do you have a fever? Too much blood? The solution? Letting blood. Yes, exactly. Let's use a hungry leech or a dull blade to drain your life force into a dish. Yes, barbers were frequently the ones who did it. Imagine having a hemoglobin extraction and a haircut all at once. Baby, you get 2 for 1. Experiencing anxiety or sadness. There is obviously too much black bile there. The remedy? Laxatives. Perhaps some prayers and a cold compress, or perhaps a warm herbal purge, while everyone avoids looking at you and begins carving your coffin. Now, you're in serious trouble if you shatter a bone or have a terrible cut. Unless you consider fainting from agony, there is no anesthesia. Knives used for surgery haven't been cleaned since the time of the Crusades. The purpose of heating tools over fire is not to sterilize them, but rather to make them appear more frightening. Antibiotics from ages ago. Germ hypothesis has not yet been developed. They believe that illness is caused by contaminated air or by God being irritated by your immoral behavior. Do you have a stomachache? Your ideas must have been sinful. I hope you like admitting while throwing up. You will receive additional leeches, probably some crushed beetles, and a clergyman at your bedside who will give you last rites in case your situation worsens. They are now getting ready for the remedy, which is death, and if you miraculously get better, everyone just thinks God is sorry for you. The leech gets promoted, while the doctor gets all the credit. Therefore, sure, medicine in the Middle Ages was more about surviving the cure than it was about healing. Finally, it's time to eat after a long day of work, lice and leeches. With a gnawing stomach, you shuffle back to your havel, eager for a warm meal, the only thing that can bring you joy in life. The news is bad. Most likely your food is attempting to murder you. Let's start with the fundamentals. There is no such thing as food preservation. There is only smoke, salt, and the hope that the winter air will keep things fresh. No refrigerator or freezer. If you are fortunate enough to have any meat, it has been hanging for days, marinated in dubious brine, coated with flies, and perhaps even shared with a few rats. The mainstay of the medieval diet is bread. Even so, it's not safe. Desperate peasants use bark, sawdust, or even mud to make it stretch during years with poor harvests. There's an added perk if it's rye season. A fungus called ergot can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and occasionally even death. It's similar to consuming bread tainted with tetanus and LSD. Vegetables, but only when they're available. What's always in style, do you know? Turnips, a lot of turnips, either floating in pottage, crushed, or boiling, which is essentially a boiling pot of unknown components that has been simmering since your great-grandfather's burial, as you recall from Chapter 3. The autumn may bring fruit, but it rots swiftly, and sugar is scarce, costly, and hoarded by the wealthy to flaunt their grizzled teeth. Dairy is an additional risk. Hours pass before fresh milk becomes bad. Cheese and butter do better, although they are bacterially dense. Since it's really either that or chew your bootle leather, people eat them nevertheless. Let's also discuss seasoning. Spices such as nutmeg, cinnamon, or pepper, more valuable than gold. Onions, salt, and, if you're lucky, pain are the main sources of flavor for the typical peasant. The majority of meals taste like damp burlap with a hint of melancholy. However, eating poses more than only health risks. It has to do with politics. The Lord owns game animals, not you. If you are caught poaching a rabbit, you can face fines, jail time, or even death. Yes, exactly. You might be hanged for your dinner. Therefore, keep in mind that every bite is dangerous when you eat your gray stew under the flickering light of the fire. Still, you eat, because food didn't nourish in the Middle Ages. It puts you to the test. It is now evening. You've endured hardship, labored, and hardly had time to process your dubious stew. Even though it may seem like the day is coming to an end, God is watching, so don't rest too much. So is the priest, and if you skip church, your neighbor Agnes will definitely tell on you. Religion was more than just a component of life in medieval Europe. It's life. Your calendar, your laws, your education, whether you can read, your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between are all governed by the church. Consider it your landlord in a spiritual sense. Additionally, you consistently miss rent. Prayer bells serve as the focal point of each day. Every morning, noon, and evening, the town church bell rings. Missing prayer is a sin, not because people need to be reminded. Don't remember to bow. Sin. Consume meat on Fridays. Sin. Consider the twofold sin of your neighbor's wife in that single dream. Indeed, hell is a real place, very real. It is described in beautiful detail by priests. Eternal wailing, devils with pitchforks, rivers of fire, and lakes of boiling blood. If you're not afraid of the disease, you will be afraid of eternal damnation. The Bible is written in Latin, a language only monks, clerics, and that one aristocratic child who's too nice for dirt can understand, so you can't read it yourself. You depend on the church to give you the meaning of everything. Therefore, it's time to kneel more if the priest says that your crop failure is due to your lack of prayer. 10% of your possessions must be paid in tithes. You donate wheat if you grow it. You offer eggs if you rear hens. Congratulations if you don't have anything. You're doomed financially and spiritually. Holidays are sacred occasions. Dozens of them. They're not for enjoyment, even though they provide respites from work. As a result, you should go to Mass, fast, confess your sins, and keep in mind that joy is a risky indulgence. Heretics are burned, witches are drowned, blasphemers are beaten, skeptics are swiftly converted, and questioning the church is perilous. Thus, you perform the actions. You chant, you bow. You hope that, if the priest approves of you, your soul will eventually arrive in paradise after living this filthy life. Because God might be forgiving in the Middle Ages. Not so much for the church, though. Try being a woman peasant in the Middle Ages if you thought it was difficult. Starvation, dirt, and dread, along with childbearing, social invisibility, and subservience. Being a woman in the Middle Ages was like being stuck in hard difficulty without any health potions or restart buttons. A girl's life path is essentially predetermined from birth. Get married young, have kids, serve your husband, and pass away exhausted. Not likely, education. Your intellectual growth ends at the time you learn how to patch a shirt and churn butter, unless you come from a noble family and are sent to a convent. Early marriage occurs. Very early. Being engaged at 12 and expecting a child at 14 is not strange. Love isn't the issue. It has to do with alliances, land, and livestock. Your viewpoint is not necessary. Once married, you're basically your husband's property. Producing heir, feeding everyone, maintaining the house, and refraining from complaining are your duties. Because if you complain, you could be called a witch or worse. Depending on local style, that term includes a free burning or drowning. The birth of a child is a death lottery. There is no anesthesia, no sterile equipment, and no prenatal care. Even slight issues can result in death for the mother, the infant, or both, despite midwives' best efforts. Some women make it through 10 pregnancies. Many also fail to survive. But don't worry, after the baby is out, your work increases. You are supposed to cook, clean, breastfeed, and still assist in the fields while living in a shack rife with lice and a screaming baby. There is no respite for you. For everyone else, you are the break. You are suspicious if you are single. If you are widowed, you are at risk. Dangerous if you are vocal. Women who did not fit the mold were sometimes suspected of witchcraft, particularly if they knew a lot about herbs, had a strong personality, or simply found someone amusing on a dreary Tuesday. There are limits to your role, even in the church. Nuns were subject to rigorous regulations. Your spiritual value, freedom of movement, and speaking without permission are all prohibited. Men are always ranked higher. In short, if you're a woman in the Middle Ages, you're expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer in silence, ideally while smiling. Because even in a time of universal suffering, women were somehow expected to endure graciously. You have already fought against social injustice, squalor, poverty, and maybe a goat, but violence strikes just when you believe your day can't get any worse. Bloody, boisterous, and, by medieval standards, frequently very appropriate. The Middle Ages were hardly a tranquil time, let's face it. Generally speaking, the concept of law and order meant hoping the local lord wasn't in a foul mood. There is violence everywhere. Crime is rampant, punishment is harsh, and justice is more performance art than protection. In the family, on the streets, in the military, in religious conflicts, and occasionally in queue at the communal bread oven. If you steal a loaf of bread, you risk losing your hand, being accused of lying, having your tongue pierced, gossiping excessively, and getting a metal mask attached to your head with a bar in your mouth as punishment. For correction, of course. Suppose you are facing significant charges: witchcraft, robbery, and heresy. How can one demonstrate their innocence? Of course, by being tormented. Greetings from trial by ordeal. In one variant, you retrieve a stone by sticking your hand into boiling water. You are innocent if it cures in 3 days without infection. If not, you are at fault. You could also be thrown into a river. You are innocent and most likely die if you sink. You are guilty and will still face consequences if you float. It resembles a medieval game show with a survival prize and a host who actively works against you. Additionally, receiving a death sentence is a public event. Hangings, beheadings, burnings, and executions are all carried out in front of applauding spectators. Snacks are occasionally brought. It's cable TV's medieval counterpart. Domestic violence is a common occurrence. It was acceptable, even expected, for husbands to reprimand their wives and kids. Street fights are widespread. Just glancing at a nobleman's horse in the wrong direction may get you thrashed, and there's always a brewing battle. Religious crusades, territorial struggles, and local feuds. In the name of honor, God, or boredom, someone is constantly going off to attack someone else. Medieval society did not collapse into violence. Society is the issue. Everybody is always aware that justice is capricious, life is brittle, and your neighbor could beat you up over a pig. Thus, proceed with caution, keep your head down, and never put your trust in anyone brandishing a club. You've survived the bugs, the leeches, the anguish of not having a job, and the imminent danger of being publicly humiliated by now. The last chapter of most medieval life, however, is an early and unglamorous death. You are essentially a celebrity if you are above 40 and still alive and well. You may even be called the Old One, which is more of a statistical marvel than a nickname. Let's dissect it. Infant mortality significantly lowers the average life expectancy, which is between 30 and 40 years. Almost half of all children passed away before turning 5. It only needed one terrible winter, disease or starvation. No hope, no antibiotics, no immunizations. If you made it through childhood, you were already worn out when you reached maturity. As soon as you were able to stand up, you started working, and by the time you were 25, your joints were creaking like a monastery door. You may have lost most of your initial optimism, along with a finger and a few teeth. Childbirth was a particularly lethal ordeal for women. For women in the Middle Ages, it was one of the main causes of death. Prayer, hot water, and someone holding your hand while you bled out on a straw-stuffed cot. No medical assistance, no pain treatment. The risks were different for men, but they were just as constant. A neighbor's inebriated fury, minor wound infections, farming mishaps, or a sidetracked crusade. Even going to the market on foot could be dangerous if you run into an irate tax collector or a bored bandit. The pandemic, which transformed cities into cemeteries overnight, could also bring death in silence. Or from hunger, which might decimate entire towns over the course of several seasons. Or from misfortune, such as consuming spoilt grain and dying while shouting against the walls and experiencing hallucinations. And if you had a funeral, you were fortunate. In order to prevent illness, bodies were frequently buried promptly. A tiny mound of earth, a pit, and a few spoken prayers. No polished coffins, no embalming. Whether the churchyard still had enough room. Indeed, life in the Middle Ages was harsh, brief, and under continual threat from death in all of its manifestations. You never retired. You simply stopped being present. Moving on to your last chapter, let's talk about exits. The dream of the Middle Ages dies. How has your day been going then? You labored till your spine ached for mercy, scratched your way through itchy wool, begged to avoid contracting the plague, washed your teeth with wishful thinking, woke up in dirt, relieved yourself in a bucket, and narrowly avoided a public execution for owning a squirrel. Greetings from a day in medieval Europe. Do you still aspire to be a knight? Rethink your thought. The Middle Ages in their idealized form. Valiant warriors, aristocratic women in towers, valiant conflicts, and feasts in enormous rooms illuminated by candles. It is a myth that has been refined by fantasy literature and fairy tales. The medieval world was, in reality, harsh, unjust, and grim. It was all about hierarchy. You remained impoverished if you were born that way. Congrats if you were born wealthy. Your chances of survival were higher. However, descent and an early death were still just one lousy soup away. Not even the nobles were exempt from suffering. Fleas, smoke, and politically motivated weddings were all part of the drafty stone freezers that was a castle. Yes, you had a goblet of wine and a fur mantle, but you also had a 50% risk of dying from an infected splinter or in a conflict. The simpler times weren't quite easy. Thus it wasn't precisely luxury. They didn't let up. It all took longer. Everything was more painful. There were repercussions for everything from chewing to birthing. Life was not leisure, but survival. And if you did, take a peaceful moment to reflect, fantasize, or visualize a better future. You could do very little with it. No modern medicine, no upward mobility, and no Google Internet. What's that strange rash? You lived within 10 miles of your birthplace, endured hardships, worked, and passed away. The wildest portion, though, comes next. People continue to find meaning, fall in love, tell stories, sing songs, and laugh despite everything. Not because life was simple, but rather because people are intransigent. They created room for light, even in the darkest chapters. Maybe offer a silent thank you to the modern world and your ancestors who battled famine, feudalism, and rats so you wouldn't have to tonight as you crawl into your clean bed with central heating, indoor plumbing, and antibiotics. She was just Sophie long before she became Catherine the Great. Empress of all Russia, reformist mistress, and symbol of ambition. Born in 1729 as Sophie Federica Augusta von Anhalt, she came from a quite unknown family of German princes. There was little power in her little douche in Pomerania. Sophie, however, there was something about her that no title could explain. Unwavering charm, razor-sharp brilliance, and a silent, raging desire for greatness. She had a harsh upbringing. Johanna, her mother, was a cold, cunning social climber who was preoccupied with status rather than a loving, caring person. The Prussian officer, who was Sophie's father, was more aloof than strict. Sophie was trained to balance obedience and slyness from an early age. She learned to observe a room before speaking in it, spoke several languages, and read a lot, abilities that would soon be necessary for survival in one of the cruelest courts in Europe. The Russian Empress, Elizabeth Petrona, looked outside of Russia when she started looking for a marriage for her successor, Grand Duke Peter. Since Peter was of German ancestry, Empress Elizabeth thought a foreign spouse who was appreciative and docile would be simpler to manage. Sophie was the ideal candidate. She'd have to give up her Lutheran faith and noble blood, and a reputation for humility and gentleness. Sophie was called to Russia when she was just 14 years old. With a polite grin and thin German textiles, she arrived in the frigid city of St. Petersburg in 1744. Like a chess piece, her mother shoved her forward, but Sophie was up to her own game. She adopted the Orthodox name Ekaterina Alexa, Catherine, in order to fit in with Russian society. It was a life-changing, symbolic, and public ceremony. She was not only converting to a new religion, she was entering a foreign empire with no way out, burning the bridge behind her. Nobody who was seeing that reserved adolescent girl wearing a coat with fur trimmings could have foreseen what would happen next. Empire, enlightenment, revolution, and treachery. However, Sophie stopped being a pawn and started making plans to become a queen as soon as she entered the Russian court. The goal of Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was to guarantee her position as a member of Russian aristocracy. However, it felt more like a prison than a crown right from the start. The prince of fairy tales was not Peter, the heir apparent to the Russian throne. Uncomfortable, naive, and fixated on toy soldiers, he was much more occupied with playing war games in his chambers than he was with running an empire or providing love to his new bride. According to other reports, he even declined to consummate the marriage for years. He hated the Russian court that had taken him in and admired Frederick the Great of Prussia. Catherine, on the other hand, welcomed Russia with a fiery resolve. She studied its history, picked up the language, and committed orthodox practices to memory. She desired to fit in. Peter desired to get away. This was not merely an emotional mismatch, it had a political bent. The Russian court was a breeding ground for vicious power struggles, paranoia, and rumor. Despite her deteriorating health, Empress Elizabeth continued to govern with unlimited power. Everyone had a plan and was aware that a change was imminent. They were always watching Catherine. Every action she took was closely examined. Her friendships were tracked and her correspondence were read. Her mother, who continued to whisper in her ear on behalf of foreign interests. Her husband, and even her servants, were untrustworthy. Alliances might quickly become accusations in this environment. Catherine, however, was not a fool. She developed allies in the background by learning how to play the court's games silently. In sharp contrast to her husband's immature outbursts and blatant disrespect for Russian customs, she won over military officers, befriended academics, and established a reputation for decorum and moderation. Catherine started reading enlightened intellectuals like Voltaire and Montesquieu behind closed doors. She was creating a vision for Russia, a country of power, education, and reason, while others viewed her as a young consort. However, there was a single issue. Catherine stayed in limbo, a helpless wife of a man unsuited to govern, for as long as Peter lived. So she watched, waited, and made plans. She was aware that no one would inherit the Russian throne. They'd have to take it. After waiting, observing, and maneuvering in silence for over 20 years, Catherine finally saw her chance in 1762 and took it with amazing accuracy. After the death of Empress Elizabeth, Peter, now Peter III, was at last Tsar, but almost immediately his reign started to fall apart. In a few months, Peter insulted the army, displeased the nobility, alienated the church, and showered Prussia, Russia's longtime adversary, with accolades. He publicly discussed divorcing Catherine in order to wed his mistress, reverted important legislation, and degraded the clergy. Already suspicious of his capricious conduct, the court became icy. In the hallways, the army, composed of Catherine-loyal generals, complained. Peter was viewed as a foreign puppet who made fun of their customs by even the most loyal and pious Russians. As she watched all of this, Catherine took action. Catherine launched a bloodless coup d'etat in July of the same year, while Peter was abroad at his summer residence. She rode into St. Petersburg in full regalia, was crowned Empress Catherine II, and gained the loyalty of the strong imperial guard with the help of important military leaders, notably her boyfriend Gregory Olaf and his powerful siblings. Peter was caught off guard and gave up in a matter of days without any allies. After being arrested, he was discovered dead under suspicious circumstances. It was officially described as a hemorrhoidal colic. It was, informally, murder. Now Catherine was empress, by will, intelligence, and audacity, not by birth or marriage. It was a first. Without a single conflict, a foreign-born woman who had no rightful claim had seized the Russian throne. But that was only the beginning of her true challenge. She needed to turn her audacious attempt at power into a legacy that would last. Would she be accepted in Russia? Would she be respected by the nobles? Would she be able to maintain the empire without meeting the same end as her husband? Power acquired by intrigue may be lost just as easily, Catherine realized. She needed to lead as a visionary, not a cunning tactician. She then started to change from a cautious plotter to a reformist empress, one who would rethink what it meant to be a woman in power, rewrite boundaries, and embrace enlightenment. Catherine may have relied on her authority once she got the throne. However, she didn't. Sitting on a throne was not the only thing she had in mind. Her goal was to change Russia, intellectually as well as politically and militarily. Catherine idolized Voltaire Dado and the daring intellectuals of the Enlightenment, whereas Peter had worshipped Frederick the Great and toy soldiers. Even though she held unlimited power, she supported reason, advancement, education, and the idea that a monarch should serve the people. Catherine read more than just enlightened philosophy. She experienced it firsthand. For more than 15 years, she wrote to Voltaire personally, praising him and justifying her authoritarianism. She even bought Dido his whole library to help him out financially and invited him to her court. She studied legal materials, discussed reforms, and created programs to modernize the empire behind closed doors. She worked to codify Russian legislation throughout her early reign. In 1767, she established a legislative commission with the lofty goal of revising Russia's entire legal system. A political manifesto in disguise, Catherine's own nakazes, or instruction, discussed issues such as equality before the law, the perils of torture, and the duty of rulers to uphold the common good. It was radical for a Russian empress in the 18th century. However, the realities of Russia, a huge, feudal, and deeply conservative country ruled by aristocrats who preferred their serfs just where they were, beneath them, meant that enlightened ideas had to endure. Catherine was aware of this. She proceeded cautiously, even as she promoted reform. She constructed schools and libraries, increased access to secular education, and outlawed various types of torture. To maintain their allegiance, she also reiterated the nobility's authority over their serfs. Catherine had to balance this. In private, a pragmatic empress, but in public, a philosophical queen. Between the glittering salons of Paris and the grim politics of Moscow, she had to balance ideology and survival. Though always strategic, her vision for Russia was audacious. Catherine was not, in many respects, attempting to Europeanize Russia. Her goal was to modernize Russia according to her standards. Yes, that meant reform, but it was done with a velvet glove on an iron hand. Reforming Russia from inside was not enough for Catherine. She aspired to make it an empire that was feared, admired, and envied by others. Catherine wanted to tear down the walls where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west. Russia's boundaries widened more than ever under her leadership. She fought wars to alter the European geography in addition of defending her throne. The Ottoman Empire was the target of one of her most important campaigns. These wars, which broke out in waves between the 1760s and 1770s, were about more than just land. They have to do with influence. Catherine believed that she was the legitimate defender of Eastern Europe and the liberator of Orthodox Christians under Muslim domination. Under the leadership of generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Pumpkin, Russia seized important areas like as Crimea, the Black Sea's northern shore, and warm water ports, all of which the Russian Tsars had long desired. These triumphs were symbolic as well as military. Catherine sends a message with every victory. Russia was no longer Europe's remote, backward cousin. The force was continental. She looked to the west as well. Catherine took part in the division of Poland through a series of agreements and diplomatic ploys, splitting the faltering Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with Austria and Prussia. By 1795, when the 3rd Division came to a conclusion, Russia had claimed millions of new subjects and enormous new areas, erasing Poland from the map. Catherine, however, did not merely use soldiers to conquer. She colonized with thoughts as well. They constructed new cities. Trade routes were extended. Russian farmland was offered to German settlers for cultivation. From the sun-drenched Black Sea coast to the frigid Baltic, the empire turned into a mosaic. Catherine continued to be the driving force behind it all, reading reports, giving instructions, and personally directing the development of her growing empire. She would be criticized for being imperialist and power-hungry. However, Catherine did not view expansion as ambition. It was fate. She felt that a great ruler was judged by borders as much as by ideals. She had more in mind than simply ruling Russia. She desired to re-establish it as a civilized empire that was devoted solely to her, feared by its adversaries and revered by its peers. Despite her greatness and influence, Catherine the Great was equally well known for what transpired in the palace. It wasn't all whispered in libraries, either. One of the most talked about parts of Catherine's reign was her private life. She had a carefully selected parade of lovers, many of whom were decades younger, frequently attractive, and occasionally powerful in politics. They weren't hidden by her. In fact, she frequently gave them pensions, estates, and titles as rewards for good behavior. Otherwise, they were gently fired, occasionally accompanied by a promotion and a kind thank you. Gregory Pumpkin, a guy as brazen as he was smart, was one of the most significant of these lovers. The distinction between passion, politics, and cooperation became hazy in their relationship. They might have even secretly married, according to some historians. Collectively, they influenced colonization efforts, military campaigns, and the development of southern Russia. Pumpkin was not only a romantic partner, in many respects, he was her co-ruler. Europe, however, was unable to ignore the issue. Rumors circulated. She was portrayed in satirical pamphlets as lusty, ravenous, and even insane, and the rumors only grew worse after she passed away. The most notorious of these was the absurd and wholly untrue story about a horse that was propagated by her adversaries in an attempt to discredit her reputation. But why the fixation? Easy. Catherine was an unrepentantly powerful woman. Furthermore, she declined to assume the position of a female ruler in a society where such roles were typically played by tragic characters or saintly virgins. She was dangerous because she ruled, lived, and loved as she saw fit. Paradoxically, Catherine was profoundly philosophical about love and sexuality, despite the fact that her detractors portrayed her as immoral. She felt that interpersonal ties didn't have to jeopardize public responsibility, and that pleasure was a normal aspect of life. Few male monarchs were able to detach emotion from governing like she did. Her relationships were actually frequently purposeful. She surrounded herself with skilled, devoted, and politically beneficial individuals. And when they were no more, she released them, generally with a kind grin and a fat retirement. Catherine's romantic life did not make her authority any less strong. It was a component of her plan, a blend of passion and force that made her unique, envied, and was afraid. Despite her charm and authority, Catherine's rule was not without danger, and that danger materialized in 1773 as Ilan Pugachev, a bearded Cossack. He wasn't your typical rebel. Pugachev claimed to be Catherine's deceased husband, Peter III. He claimed that he had returned to retake the kingdom from the German usurper after surviving the coup. It was ridiculous. Peter had long since left. To the downtrodden and weary lower classes of Russia, however, the assertion did not have to be accurate. All it had to do was give hope. Pugachev pledged the common people land, reduced taxes, freedom, and an end to slavery. Particularly among Kazakhs' peasants and elderly believers, his remarks spread like wildfire throughout the vile river region. His promises sounded like a beacon of hope during a period when the divide between serfs and nobles had grown ruthlessly. The biggest peasant revolt in Russian history was the Pugachev insurrection. Fortresses collapsed, towns were captured, and aristocrats were killed. It looked for a horrifying moment, as though the empire itself would fall apart. Catherine trembled. She couldn't use treaties and cavalry to win this foreign war. This was an uprising against the system from inside her own people. She was in charge. Catherine, however, remained calm. She took action. She sent in professional troops to brutally put an end to the uprising. In 1774, Pugachev's army was routed. As a public warning to anyone who might follow, he was apprehended, put on display in an iron cage, and ultimately decapitated in Moscow. Catherine then stepped up her efforts to maintain authority and order. Her visions of silently freeing the serfs vanished. In a nation still bound by feudalism, the insurrection had demonstrated to her the boundaries of enlightenment. She now depended more on the nobles, who promised her devotion in return for complete command over their serfs. This marked a sea change. Stability was now more important to the empress, who had once quoted Voltaire than philosophy. Reform grew wary. The level of surveillance rose. Even the muttered rebellion was to be crushed before it could breathe. Even though Pugachev lost his head, Catherine was troubled by the warning he left behind. That inequitable power structure could only last so long before the storm broke out. Catherine the Great was the longest reigning female queen in Russian history, having ruled for more than 30 years by the time she was nearing the end of her life. She had changed her empire, defied expectations, and reinterpreted what a woman and a queen could be from the minute she came to power. Russia developed into a real European powerhouse during Catherine's rule. Crimea, portions of Poland, and Aportia. Portions of the Black Sea coast were all absorbed into its more than 200,000 square mile territory expansion. These wins were not merely military. They were important turning points that changed trade and secured warm water ports. But maps weren't the sole representation of her legacy. Catherine also made a cultural impact. She corresponded with the brightest minds of the Enlightenment, accumulated one of Europe's largest art collections, and assisted in founding the Hermitage Museum. Her court developed into a hub of intellectual aspiration, art, and elegance. Catherine established Russia firmly on the cultural map of a nation that Western Europeans frequently consider to be backward. She encouraged the publishing of books and modernized education by establishing schools for girls. In an act of scientific courage for her era, she publicly received the vaccination and brought the smallpox injection to Russia. However, her rule was also marked by inconsistencies. Despite her admiration for enlightened principles, she never set the serfs free. She really spread serfdom farther into Russian territory. Although remarkable, her changes were primarily top-down and aimed at enhancing the empire rather than radically altering its core. Nevertheless, stability and ambition were brought about by Catherine's reign. She realized that one did not inherit authority. It was planned, coordinated, and continuously protected. She reigned by willpower, political savvy, and unrelenting calculation rather than a divine right. She went by various names including seductress, reformer, tyrant, and user. But most importantly, she worked. Russia was richer, bigger, and more powerful than it had been in ages when she passed away in 1796. She left an empire growing, a throne safe, and a mythology that would last for centuries. Catherine did more than simply rule. She reigned with strategy, intelligence, and an unreserved hold on history. She went beyond being an empress as a result. She turned into a legend. Catherine the Great was fundamentally a woman navigating a man's world and remaking it in her image, notwithstanding her influence, growth, and lasting legacy. Someone who was very aware of how vulnerable her position was hidden behind the state decrees and imperial images. She wasn't Russian by birth. A coup brought her to the throne. She oversaw an empire that was opposed to having a woman in leadership roles. Nevertheless, she not only survived, but flourished. Being decorative was never enough for Catherine. She never stopped studying, never stopped writing, and never stopped reading. She had a very busy schedule every day. Hours spent reviewing reports, communicating with foreign powers, revising official documents, and running a court with conflicting factions. Sitting on the throne was not enough for her. Like a born stateswoman, she worked the throne. In many respects, she was also lonely. In her memoirs, she described how few people she could really trust, despite surrounding herself with courtiers, lovers, and artists. She feared that her progress would be undone by her son Paul, whom she mistrusted and avoided involving in state affairs. Although her strongest emotional bond with Gregory Pemkin dissolved into a close friendship, his passing in 1791 left a scar that would never fully go away. Catherine created her image carefully. She was more adept at using narrative than other rulers of her era, and she recognized its power. She pretended to be the mother of Russia, a warrior, an empress, an educated ruler, and an art enthusiast. Beneath those roles, however, lay a woman who had persevered through rejection, betrayal, controversy, and rebellion. She left behind a changed but also uncertain empire when she passed away in 1796. Was there anything she could have done to stop serfdom? Did politics undermine her enlightened ideals? Was she a ruler or a reformer? She never called herself the Great, but history remembers her as such. It wasn't because she was perfect, nice, or fair. It was because, in a time and place where women were not supposed to have authority, she seized it and used it as she saw fit. She wore more than just the crown. She changed the definition of deserving of one. Stories from the ancient Maya world are whispered by the remains of Palenque in the humid depths of the Chiapas jungle in southern Mexico. With their limestone faces worn by time yet still full of mysteries, towering temples rise above the canopy. And one of those secrets came to light in 1994. Temple 3, a somewhat little pyramid adjacent to the more well-known Temple of the Inscriptions, the resting place of the powerful monarch Pl the Great. was being surveyed by a group of Mexican archaeologists under the direction of Fanny Lopez Jimenez. Before they saw something strange, they didn't think the throne would hold much. A concealed, locked compartment underneath the building. It had not been touched by looters. It was immaculate. The archaeologists discovered a stone sarcophagus lying quietly inside when they broke through and descended. The weight of centuries weighed heavily on the air. Red dust, dazzling, blazing red, ascended like smoke when they raised the lid. Cinnabar, a poisonous mercury sulfide that the Mir used ceremonially, was powdered and spread over the interior, and the skeleton of a woman lay inside that red cloud. She had been respectfully and carefully buried. Her corpse was encircled by ear spools, necklaces, diadems, and other jewelry made of jade and shell, and her bones were delicate but undamaged. Her skull was still wearing a jade mask. The funeral exuded aristocracy in every way. But there was no name written. She was unidentified by glyphs. In Mesoamerica, it was among the wealthiest female graves ever discovered. Nevertheless, it was a complete mystery. Why was red powder used to bury her? Who was she? Could she have been Pal's wife, a queen, or a priestess? She was dubbed the Red Queen by the researchers, and the moniker stuck. They were only able to determine that she had lived during Palank's golden age in the 7th century. But even with contemporary forensics, they were unable to identify her with certainty. Her burial had been concealed, unaltered, and deliberately segregated, in contrast to the majority of Maya tombs. Her funeral was more than a formality. It had a spiritual quality. Words weren't supposed to be used to memorialize this woman. Color, ritual, and the mystery she left behind were all intended to serve as reminders of her. The silence of the locked room and the Red Queen's jade jewelry were not the most eerie aspects of her tomb. The crimson dust was the cause. Everything was covered with a thick layer of powdered cinnabar. Her bones, the walls, the sarcophagus, and even the offerings surrounding her. It stuck to the stone like blood. This was no accident to the Maya. One of the most revered and hazardous materials in ancient times was cinnabar, which was manufactured from crushed mercury sulfide. Its vivid red hue was more than just eye-catching. It represented rebirth, blood, and the life energy that united the divine and human worlds. Red was revered. It represented daybreak, sacrifice, and the rebirth of life after death. It wasn't merely symbolic either. It had a spiritual quality. It was customary to cover the deceased in cinnabar in order to change their body and preserve it for transition rather than eternity. The Maya believed that life continued beyond death. It was a transition into a different layer of the cosmos. Therefore, the Red Queen, whatever she was being readied for deification as well as burial. There's more to this, though. Cinnabar is poisonous. Mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, and even death can result from repeated exposure. The chemistry was probably beyond the Mer's comprehension, yet they sensed its power. It was hazardous, strong, and volatile. It was an indication that this individual was not your typical mortal to bathe the corpse in it. Few people were buried with cinnabar in Palank. The site is dominated by the pyramid of Pal the Great, the mighty king. The scarlet powder drenched his body just as it did hers. Just that detail sparked conjecture. Was the Crimson Queen his mother, his wife, or another supernatural being of a similar rank? Another sacred emblem, jaguar hide, had been used to cover her head. Miniature jade figurines, obsidian knives, and bone needles surrounded her, suggesting rites carried out in her honor at death or throughout her lifetime. Without using words, every aspect of her funeral communicated a tale. It's a secret story of power. A woman dressed in the color of sacrifice, ready to enter the underworld ceremoniously rather than in silence. A realm of silence, broken only by the brilliance of jade, shell, and obsidian, surrounded the Red Queen's crimson-soaked bones. These weren't just decorations. They were sacrifices, each one specifically selected to travel with her to the Xibalba, the Maya afterlife. Jade necklaces, cold and heavy, their polished surfaces still glowing from 300 years beneath, hung at her sides. Jade was more than just gorgeous. It was holy. It was seen by the Maya as a representation of perpetual life. It stood for the god's breath, the jungle's vigor, and the maze's green. Jade was only used for wealthy burials. It covered the Red Queen's ears, wrists, and chest. A blatant indication that she had power in life, possibly even divine favor. The Jadireri mask that was carefully draped over her face was among the most eerie items. Constructed from dozens of tiny mosaic tiles set to resemble the features of her skull, this death mask was delicate in contrast to the gilded ones of Egypt. In the eyes of the gods, the mask was a ceremonial tool used to safeguard the soul, maintain identity, and portray her as divine. Artifacts from shells, obsidian knives, and bone needles were scattered around her bones. These might have been ceremonial implements or representations of her position as a royal matriarch, priestess, or healer. There was a single bone pin with a faint but intentional engraving. Her words faded into a tiny echo. Ceramic containers that were still sealed and probably originally held offerings were found at her feet and around the tomb's boundaries. Incense, food, or drink to keep her soul alive after death. The mayor thought that the afterlife was a perilous, complex, and difficult trip. These weren't luxury goods. They were essential. In order to modernize, the tomb feels purposeful rather than crowded. There were only objects selected with spiritual significance, no gold, chariots, or grandeur. It served as a soul map. Through these artifacts, we get a glimpse of the Maya's understanding of death as a transfer of power rather than as finality. The Red Queen was not laid to rest in obscurity. They were getting her ready to climb. The Red Queen left one eerie vacuum in spite of the splendor of her mausoleum. Her sarcophagus bore neither a name nor any inscriptions. She was not recognized by the glyphs on the walls. She was obviously a strong woman. However, who? Scholars started attempting to make connections as soon as her tomb was unearthed. The most convincing explanation was that the Red Queen was Zakbu-A, the wife of Kinich Janab Pal, the most well-known Palankese ruler and now known as Pal the Great. Zakbu-Aha was not merely Pal's partner. She married into Palank's royal lineage at an early age after being born into a noble family. During her husband's rule, she was an important ceremonial figure and had at least 3 sons, all of whom were highly esteemed. She was the only one who could be buried with such dignity. The tomb's placement in Temple of the Inscriptions, only a few steps from Pal's own opulent funeral, lends credence to this notion. The closeness points to a purposeful marriage, making the couple monarchs even after they pass away. And the Sinibar comes next. There were only 2 burials in Palank that had this level of Sinibar coverage: the Red Queen and Pal. This was hardly likely to be a coincidence. This is where the mystery becomes more complex. In an attempt to verify the connection, DNA testing were performed on both sets of remains. However, the findings are not conclusive. There was no clear maternal connection between Pal and the woman's bones. But that didn't rule out a spousal relationship. After all, shared blood is not a prerequisite for marriage. She might have been Sakuk, Pal's strong mother who dominated Palank before he reached adulthood, according to certain theories. Others speculate that she might have been a sister, a high priestess, or a royal ancestor whose name has only been obscured by the passage of time. However, the overwhelming weight of the evidence suggests that Taku-Ao, a mother of kings, a queen by title, and Pal's spiritual equivalent, is the most likely candidate. The absence of a name might not be a mistake. It might have been deliberate. According to Maya cosmology, ritual, symbolism, and the Earth's whispers were how the spirit survived rather than monuments. The Red Queen is thus still caught between myth and reality. A woman in power remembered in quiet and scarlet, not in stone. We must comprehend the world from which the Red Queen originated if we are to comprehend her. A society in which Maya women, particularly those from royal families, had greater power than most people realize. Politics in Maya society was frequently a family matter. Royal women were more than just submissive spouses. They were power brokers, priestesses, and ambassadors. They sponsored temples, performed rites, and were essential to preserving the legitimacy of the dynasty. They secured claims to the throne and formed alliances using their bloodlines as political capital. For instance, consider Pal the Great's mother, Sakuk. She assumed control of Palanque once the throne became vacant and was queen regent until her son reached adulthood. She wasn't a stand-in. She was a sovereign in her own right, enforcing laws and managing building projects. Pal might not have climbed at all without her. She was also not an exception. Inscriptions from locations like Yakilan, Nanjo, and Calakmul around the Maya civilization depict women conducting important rituals, participating in diplomacy during war, and occasionally holding absolute power. They were frequently shown in murals and paintings, wearing ornate headdresses and regalia, and standing next to or occasionally above rulers as equals. They had engraved their words in glyphs. Until they weren't, their names were recalled. Much of the recollection had been lost by the time Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later. Native women were viewed as silent characters in a world dominated by men via the colonial lens. The archaeology, however, reveals a distinct picture of intricate gender dynamics in which power was not just inherited but also negotiated. The Red Queen is viewed differently in this light. Even though she may not have held official power, her burial, rich, hallowed, and placed next to Pal, indicates that she was a key member of the royal family. Her jade mask was more than ornamentation. It served as a representation of identity, strength, and protection in both life and death. Palanca's dynasty might have been held together by her bloodline. A queen in Maya culture was more than just a queen. She was a voice in ceremonies, a guardian of sacred heritage, and frequently the link between the gods and humans. Despite having no name, the Red Queen had a voice in her kingdom. Treasures were not the only items buried with the Red Queen. She was buried amid purpose-driven building that was layered with ritual, symbolism, Maya cosmology, and deliberate design. It was more than just a grave in her mausoleum. It served as an entrance to eternity. Inside Temple Third, one of the lesser pyramids in the center of Palanque, her body was found. However, it is telling because it is close to the Temple of the Inscriptions, where Pal the Great is buried. These temples were not constructed at random. Their hallowed placement was determined by myth, astrology, and dynastic heritage. In comparison to its majestic neighbor, Temple the Thi rises modestly. However, it conceals something even more personal, an impeccably preserved sealed vault that has not been disturbed. It was built deep inside the temple, only reachable by a small, steep staircase. It almost feels like a ritual trek down into the underworld as she descends into her tomb. The room itself is bare, composed of carved stone, and has been firmly shut for more than 1,130 years. The walls are devoid of murals or glyphs. Her narrative is not told by elaborate sculptures. Maybe, though, that stillness is deliberate. This was a place where the dead may change, not for the living to understand. In the middle is her sarcophagus, which is a limestone altar. It sounds like Pal's opulent stone coffin next door. The Red Queen's tomb is more muted than Pal's lid, which is renowned for its engravings of cosmic rebirth. The Siniabar, the body, and the death rite itself are the inward focal points. Nevertheless, there are subliminal architectural clues that suggest significance. The tomb's east-west alignment represents a symbolic passage that reflects the sun's transition from life to death. Despite its modest size, the chamber is strong. It feels purposeful, intimate, and like a hallowed space for a person of high regard. The Maya temples served as cosmological instruments and conduits between the ground, the underworld, and the skies. To be laid to rest in one was to transcend the human plane. It was not an afterthought that the Red Queen would have an eternal residence. It was a meticulously built temple, a place where metamorphosis was the result of death. Her legacy is in the architecture itself, her bones are in stone, and her essence is in Siniabar, a shrine that conveys her importance to us without using words. Death was not the end for the ancient Maya. It was a threshold, a hallowed entryway into Xibalba, the underworld. Furthermore, this crossing was more than just a spiritual one for the Red Queen. It was highly ritualized, cosmological, and political. The purpose of the meticulously planned, myth-based burial rites was to help the soul navigate the perilous depths of the underworld. We can infer from Maya writings and imagery that Sabala was not a tranquil afterlife. There were gods of death, trials, rivers of blood, and a labyrinth of darkness. The only people who could successfully complete the journey were those who were ritually prepared, appropriately buried, and spiritually prepared. Encased in stone, wrapped in Siniabar, and surrounded by offerings, the Red Queen was laid to rest. Every indication of a dignified funeral. There's more, though. Obsidian knives and bone needles found in her grave provide evidence of auto-sacrifice practices. Perhaps symbolic objects that symbolize the rites she had exercised during her lifetime or that were played out during her funeral to strengthen her soul. The meticulously constructed heraldry mask out of jade tiles was more than just ornamental. As she traveled into the afterlife, it might have acted as a spiritual vessel, keeping her identity and face intact. According to Maya doctrine, the soul must be acknowledged by the gods, and the face is a reflection of the soul. In the next world, she might have been fed by chocolate, maize, water, or perhaps pulka in the pottery pots that surrounded her. Other objects, such as shell trumpets or stingray spines, might have served as ritual communication symbols, summons to the gods, or spiritual instruments. The burial was more than a farewell. It was a change. Cycles were a belief of the Maya. The afterlife is rebirth, burial is planting, and death is seed. Many people believed that kings and queens were God's earthly manifestations, and they went back to their magnificent beginnings in death. The Red Queen was being prepared for rebirth, not as a mortal, but as a creature bound to the sacred order of the cosmos after being coated in blood, buried in a pyramid, and honored with offerings. Her narrative didn't stop with her burial. It marked the start of her legend. One of Mesoamerica's most famous tombs is located a short distance from the Red Queen's ultimate resting place, that of Pal the Great, whose real name was Kinich Janab Pal. His interment within the Grand Temple of the Inscriptions is renowned for its grandeur, artistic quality, and profoundly spiritual meaning. Not only is the contents of the Red Queen's tomb remarkable, but so is the location of its discovery. Her sarcophagus was concealed in Temple 3, just next to the monument dedicated to Pal. This proximity wasn't by accident in a city like Palanque, where each temple was thoughtfully placed to represent cosmic principles. It was deliberate, an unchangeable declaration. The Red Queen, according to many academics, was the queen and dependable consort of Zakbu-Ao, Pala. The resemblance between their funerals is remarkable, even though her tomb is unmarked. Both were buried with jade, wrapped in Siniabar, buried in pyramids, and handled with the utmost respect. Like two halves of a sacred story, these rituals reflect one another. In the well-known cosmic tableau of death and rebirth, Pal's lid shows him plummeting into the underworld tree. Such iconography is absent from the Red Queen's more straightforward tomb, but the juxtaposition itself is symbolic. The moon, a feminine force that takes its own enigmatic route in the sky, would have been symbolized by the Red Queen if Pal stood in for the sun, which travels through the underworld at night before rising anew. When combined, they represented a cosmic duality: sun and moon, monarch and queen, Ritual and order, male and female. There were multiple rulers in Maya mythology. Relationships were involved. Balance was necessary for cosmic harmony, and the dynastic court was no exception to that balance. The Maya were maintaining a cosmic alliance in addition to a marriage by positioning the Red Queen next to Pal. Their positions in life might have been reflected in their closeness to death. A queen who shares a throne and a legacy with her king, rather than standing behind him, they talk without words in their tombs. Over all eternity, two souls bound together with stone and Cineaba united, one of the holiest silences in history. The Red Queen of Palenque is remembered as one of the most mysterious and influential ladies of antiquity, despite the fact that her name has been lost to time. After being sealed for more than 1,300 years, her tomb now echoes through the ages, raising questions that get louder with each new finding. She stands for an enigma that continues to elude complete comprehension. We might never be able to identify her precisely. Her name was not engraved in a glyph. Her story was not given by a thief. However, the meticulousness of her funeral, the abundance of her offerings, and the significance of her blood-red bones all point to a woman who was not just a wife or consort, but also a person with genuine power, spiritual significance, and royal ancestry. The Red Queen makes us rethink our presumptions today. She serves as a reminder that women were not quiet in the world of the ancient Maya. They formed dynasties, oversaw towns, and conducted ceremonies. The Red Queen's comeback serves as a reminder that authority was not only held by men, even though rulers like Pal had long held the limelight. Mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries were all conduits for it. The items she left behind are only one aspect of her legacy. It's the discussion she has sparked between historians, archaeologists, storytellers, and artists. Every layer of Cineaba, every jade bead, and every architectural decision in the temple all convey a purposeful message. This woman was important. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her narrative is that, not what we already know, but what we do not yet know, we learn from the Red Queen that history is more than simply a set of facts. A common human desire to establish a connection with the past is a living puzzle. In that way, her legacy continues to develop. Red, the color of sacrifice, life, blood, and rebirth, is wrapped around her. Once concealed by a jade mask, her face now gazes back at us via awe, art, and science. She doesn't have a name, but she has a voice, not forgotten, but mysterious. In death, the Red Queen rules something bigger than the kingdom she governed in life, our imagination. Stone was used to seal her tomb. Silently, her story was written. She still manages to speak. On July 6, 1907, Frida Kahlo was born in the bustling Coyoacan neighborhood. Afterward, a town outside of Mexico City. The Casa Azul, also known as the Blue House, where she grew up, was a place of paradox, color, and subdued power. Later on, it would serve as a battlefield, a sanctuary, and a museum dedicated to one of the most famous artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of 4 daughters born to Matilda Calderón, a devoted Catholic of Spanish and indigenous ancestry, and Guillermo Carlo, a German-Hungarian photographer. Her parents couldn't be more different, and smart and reserved Guillermo. Religious and emotionally aloof, Matilda. In addition to her mother's fiery tenacity, Frida would acquire her father's reflective nature and artistic sensibility. Frida was brave, talkative, and creative as a child. She asked questions that most adults didn't want to answer and read a lot. However, she got polio when she was 6 years old, which made her right leg weaker and thinner than the other. She attempted to cover up the physical difference with long skirts, but she never let it break her spirit. She was separated from other kids and bedridden for months due to the disease. She became close to her father during this period, who urged her to maintain her mental acuity, exercise, and ride a bicycle. Frida did not want to be a wife or a housewife like most girls of her era did. At the age of 15, she enrolled in Mexico City's esteemed National Preparatory School with the intention of becoming a doctor, one of the few girls who were accepted. In addition to her intelligence, she was notable there for her rebellious wit, unconventional ideas, and distinct sense of style. She became a member of the Cachuchas, a group of young thinkers who engaged in political, literary, and philosophical debate. Frida was drawn to ideas that went against the grain and to revolution. However, Frida Kahlo was already establishing herself in the world with sharp edges, unrepentant beliefs, and an identity too large to fit under anyone else's expectations even in those early years, before the bus accident that would define her body and the celebrity that would define her legacy. She wasn't only a cocaine kid. She was getting ready to completely reinvent herself. The life of Frida Kahlo was divided on September 17, 1925. The woman she was compelled to become and the girl she had been. After school that afternoon, she and her lover, Alejandro Gomez Arras, got aboard a wooden bus. They were presumably bickering, laughing, and making fun of one another. Frida never took a half-hearted approach. Her future abruptly unraveled into stillness, metal, and misery after the bus and a streetcar collided a short while later. The collision was horrifying. The bus was smashed against a wall by the streetcar, sending passengers flying and splintering the wood. An iron handrail impaled Frida. It went through her pelvis and into her left hip. 3 fractures occurred in her spinal column. She broke her right leg. She dislocated her foot. Her ribs and collarbone cracked. She had a dislocated shoulder. She had a pierced abdomen. She was only 18. A man threw a borrowed overcoat over her. Someone else saw that the gold powder she had been carrying in a pouch was the reason her body was gleaming, not blood. On impact, it had exploded, scattering what appeared to be dazzling ash across her shattered form. After being brought to the Red Cross hospital, Frida had multiple procedures in the months that followed. She lay flat on her back in a body cast for weeks, writhing in pain and confusion. With each day that went by, her dream of becoming a doctor drew farther and farther away. However, something started to move amid that silence. She received brushes from her father. A unique easel was rigged by her mother to dangle over her bed. On the canopy was a mirror so she could view herself. Frida started painting while she lay there in anguish and plaster. Out of boredom at first, then obsession. Since she was all she had, her earliest themes were reflections of herself. However, vanity was not what surfaced. It was a matter of survival. She was physically broken by the crash, but it also created an opportunity, a portal to her own body and mind, and ultimately to the strange language of identification and suffering that would come to characterize her work. One brushstroke at a time. The girl who had a desire to heal others started healing herself. Frida Kahlo started painting when she lay wrapped in steel and plaster, her body struggling to breathe. What began as therapy quickly evolved into a language. And that was exactly the point. The language was intensely intimate, brutally honest, and frequently difficult to look at. Frida did not depict courteous landscapes or lovely flowers. She depicted her own physical, emotional, and existential suffering. Her early works were small-scale, painted on tin or wood panels inspired by Mexican ritos, devotional paintings meant to tell stories of suffering and miracles. Her first subjects were self-portraits, not because she was conceited, but because, as she famously stated, "I paint myself because I'm so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Frida introspectively turned this custom around. The canvas was her body, her feelings turned into the altar. She portrayed herself as bleeding, punctured, and split. Like a contemporary martyr, she is impaled by nails in one painting. In another, she is tied to a broken column, which serves as a metaphor for her damaged spine, and she floats in a desolate setting. Despite being stripped, broken, decapitated, and crying, she never depicted herself as passive. constant observation. She was not sanitized in her pain. She used beauty, defiance, and even humor to depict the ugly side of trauma. Her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a society that frequently attempted to define her were all reclaimed in each piece. Frida wasn't merely narrating her narrative, though. She was creating a brand new type of visual story, one that combined symbolism, medical illustration, surrealism, and Mexican folk art. Her paintings, surrounded in myth, culture, and color, turned into surreal autopsies of her soul. Frida was no longer the young woman who had aspired to become a doctor by the time she was well enough to walk once more, albeit in agony. She was an artist, and no one had ever seen her work before. The worst thing that had ever happened to her had been transformed into a source of inspiration by her. Frida Kahlo painted more than just her suffering. She transformed sorrow into a holy act of self-expression by forcing the world to look at it. When Frida Kahlo met Diego Rivera in 1928, she was still recuperating, still drawing, and only 21 years old. Their relationship would turn out to be the most intense and tumultuous of her life. He was already the most well-known painter in Mexico and was 20 years her senior. Rivera was a titan of Mexican mural art, renowned for his expansive, politically charged frescoes that depicted the history of the Mexican people. He was enormous in both size and presence. Frida had previously seen his art. She liked it. Now, though, she sought his feedback on her efforts. "Do I have talent?" she asked bluntly, interrupting his scaffolded work at the Ministry of Education after she brought him her paintings. Diego looked at her and said, "Yes, and not just out of kindness." He saw something rare in her, an unfiltered voice, raw and unpretentious, full of rage, irony, pain, and beauty. They started a relationship that was both creative and consuming. The other was Diego. Frida reportedly remarked, "I suffered 2 accidents in my life, one in which a streetcar knocked me down." 1929 saw their marriage. A strange combination for outsiders. Diego, big, disloyal, well-known in politics. Frida, who is fiercely independent, sharp-tongued, and already uses a cane to walk. Her parents referred to it as an elephant-dove marriage. Their relationship was tumultuous, yet intense. Diego pushed her to develop as a painter and supported her artistic endeavors. However, he was also consistently unfaithful, even to Christina, Frida's own sister. In response to Frida's heartbreak, she allegedly had affairs with painter Georgia O'Keeffe and Leon Trotsky, among other men and women. They remarried a year later on different terms, after divorcing in 1939. Frida would retain her independence, her house, her money, and her name this time. Their second marriage focused more on mutual understanding and artistic collaboration than it did on conventional love. Diego continued to be an important part of Frida's life in spite of the pain and betrayals. He put her to the test. He hurt her, but he also saw her as a revolutionary, an artist, and a woman who might change the definition of painting. They were renowned, but not peaceful together. While Diego Rivera was working on well-known mural commissions in the 1930s, Frida Kahlo traveled north with him to places like San Francisco, Detroit, and New York. She experienced American industrialism, affluence, and the contradictions of capitalism during her years overseas, which left her feeling deeply uneasy politically. Frida was an enthusiast of indigenous customs, a fervent communist, and a staunch Mexican nationalist. Her sense of disillusionment was only heightened by the luxury she saw in the United States, particularly during the Great Depression, when much of the nation was devastated. She made fun of the culture's consumerism and fixation on appearances in letters home. She missed Mexico's paradox, color, and gritty nature. Frida started painting more intimate, smaller revolutions on canvas and tin, while Diego painted massive murals on industrial walls. She developed a distinct, incisive, bizarre, emotive, and personal style. She created some of her most famous self-portraits during this period. Frida painted herself for more reasons than vanity. To survive, she painted herself. Her landscape became her identity. She turned inward since her body was in chronic pain following her accident, several operations, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit. She was depicted in her portraits as wounded, broken, and vulnerable. However, her expression was consistently composed, straightforward, and unrepentant. Henry Ford Hospital, one of her most potent pieces, depicts her sobbing while laying on a hospital bed amid floating emblems of grief. A fractured pelvis, medical equipment, a snail, and a fetus. It was intensely emotional, graphic, and unvarnished. A canvas dripping with reality. Frida became deeply involved in left-wing politics after returning to Mexico. During Leon Trotsky's exile, she and Diego took him into their house. Frida made a political and cultural statement by dressing in traditional indigenous clothing, known as Tijuana dresses, in addition to wearing them for fashion. Her values and her art were always intertwined. In her work, her beliefs, body, and identity were all interwoven. Frida depicted the human cost of revolution while Rivera painted murals on it. The self is constantly staring back, the body is in parts, and the mind is on fire. She developed into a painter of resistance as well as suffering while she was in exile and ill. Frida Kahlo was more than just Diego Rivera's wife when she returned to Mexico in the late 1930s. She had transformed into a force and an artist whose work exuded cultural identity, strange symbolism, and unvarnished honesty. When she returned home, she totally embraced who she was. In Coyoacan, her Casa Azul turned into a haven of paradox and color. Aztec idols in the garden, bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, and free-ranging parrots and monkeys. Frida's imagination came to life in the house. It was a fusion of earth and elegance, tradition and rebellion. She surrounded herself with revolutionary texts, folk art, exotos, and pre-Columbian artifacts here. Amidst the sounds of mariachi music on the street outside and the aroma of copal incense, she painted, wore striking Tijuana gowns, and wore flowers in her hair. There was a creative explosion during this time. Her paintings were increasingly complex, political, and symbolic. A divided self was exposed by pieces such as the two Fridas. One wearing native garb, powerful and calm, the other wearing European clothing with a bleeding heart. It served as Frida's visual autobiography, a portrayal of her origins, love, and sorrow. Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky were among the painters who commended her fiercely distinctive approach when she displayed her work in Paris in 1939. Frida, however, was unique even among the surrealists. She resisted André Breton's attempt to call her one of their own. "They thought I was a surrealist," she stated. She painted Mexico, not the idyllic postcard image, but the vibrant, living nation she loved. But I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality. The symbolism in her work was palpable. Hearts, thorns, maize, blood, hummingbirds, and skeletons. She exposed the violence of her country's past and today while respecting its indigenous roots. However, her health was deteriorating even as her creative voice became more powerful. Chronic pain, infections, and numerous procedures became commonplace. Despite this, she painted through it while propped up in bed with her fingers clasped around the brush and her chest tied in corsets. Not to rest, but to regain her influence through politics, painting, and her unafraid self-acceptance, Frida had returned to Mexico. Frida Kahlo's body began to betray her as the 1940s went on. She has a deteriorating spine. Her right leg was diseased all the time. Throughout her life, she had over 30 surgeries, frequently in quick succession. She occasionally spent months in bed, immobilized by traction devices that stretched her bones apart or covered in body casts. She painted nevertheless. Throughout these years, every canvas became into an act of resistance as well as a release. Her art became more rebellious and darker. She refused to hide behind metaphor and painted with a clarity honed by suffering. Her body is wounded with nails, and she appears split down the middle in the shattered column, with a fractured ionic column in place of her spine. She has a stoic face, though. Her eyes did not flinch. For Frida, pain was more than a topic. It was her muse, her enemy, and her companion. Her voice also became more politicized. She sent vehement messages, marched in protests, joined the Mexican Communist Party, and denounced injustice and imperialism. She stubbornly held placards and shouted slogans while attending rallies in a wheelchair when her health prevented her from walking. It was long overdue for Frida to have her first solo show in Mexico in 1953. Doctors informed her she couldn't go because of how precarious her condition was. That's what only Frida would do then. She was taken in on a stretcher after arriving by ambulance and was laid out on her hospital bed in the middle of the gallery. She welcomed guests with tequila, laughing, and the fire still burning in her eyes while wearing traditional finery and surrounded by her own creations. Her last works were frightening and innocent. She painted herself wearing a steel corset held by Marx's hands in Marxism will give health to the sick, removing symbols of tyranny. A still life featuring sliced watermelons is her most recent known creation. She remained bold, cheerful, and political despite death, as evidenced by one work that read, "Viva la vida, long live life." Not all of Frida Kahlo's final portraits were of herself. They were revolutionary deeds, shown in agony, but invariably marked with vitality. Frida Kahlo passed away on July 13, 1954, at the age of 47 in La Casa Azul, Coyoacan, where she was born. Although a pulmonary embolism was reported as the official cause, her closest friends and family suspected something more serious. Yes, she had been sick, but she had also been worn out by the pain, the surgeries, and the protracted battle with her own body. She had been to a political demonstration against the CIA coup in Guatemala only a few days prior. Despite being weak and confined to a wheelchair, she persisted in going, her fist clenched. Her last heartbeat was still revolution. Her final journal entry was succinct yet sharp. "I hope to leave with delight and never to come back." The Palacio de Belicertes, Mexico's most esteemed cultural center, hosted Frida's funeral. Friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries guarded her body, which was covered in the Mexican Communist Party's red flag. Diego Rivera was distraught. He referred to her as his life's greatest love, even though she had almost been broken by his betrayals. But something remarkable occurred in the years after her passing. Frida Kahlo would not go away. Her name was initially solely mentioned in art circles. It was difficult to classify her paintings since they were too fantastical for traditionalists and too political for surrealists. However, her tale, her image, and her defiance gradually gained traction. Frida's voice gained prominence during the 1970s and 1980s when feminist scholars and activists recovered voices that had been overlooked. She was no longer merely a painter. She represented the transformation of suffering into beauty, the emergence of feminism via resistance, the unapologetic celebration of Mexican identity, queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. She got famous for her features, unibrow, eyes, and hair flowers. Her house was turned into a museum. Her journal turned, become a holy book. And the best museums in the world now display her artwork. A large portion of Frida Kahlo's life had been spent in Diego's shadow. But she stepped forward in death. She left behind more ame than simply artwork. She challenged us all to look in the mirror she left behind, not with fear or sympathy, but with fire. The image of Frida Kahlo is all over today, printed on t-shirts, transformed into dolls, posters, memes, and icons, and painted on murals. Her direct stare, flower-crowned hair, and distinctive unibrow were all easily identifiable. Not only do people remember her face, but they also understand the reality behind it, which is what gives her legacy its strength. Frida made no effort to be perfect. She was not a box fitter. She didn't want to be conventional, and she wasn't. She provided us with realism in a world that expects perfection. Raw, untidy, colorful, irate, happy, conflicting reality. She was proud of her uniqueness. She transformed her disability, queerness, politics, and culture into art that cut across boundaries and time periods. She is no longer only an artist. She is a worldwide representation of feminism, rebellion, cultural pride, and artistic resistance. She is regarded by gay communities as a courageous bisexual figure who lived freely and fearlessly during a period when silence was required. She serves as a reminder to women that they don't need permission to exercise authority. She is evidence that pain can inspire, not deter, artists with disabilities. She is also a strong, folkloric, reclaimed daughter who will always be a part of Mexico's identity. Her paintings are now among the most admired in the world, having earlier been written down as being too odd or intimate. Not only are pieces like the broken column and the self-portrait of the two Fridas with the thorn necklace and hummingbird visible. Anyone who has ever experienced pain and needed to transform that pain into something sacred may relate to them on a deep level. She made them the center of attention while living in the periphery. Contradiction was something she welcomed. A gold-clad communist. A woman who fell in love again was betrayed. A broken body with an unshakable soul. She painted with conviction throughout it all, not just with color. Being a symbol was not something Frida Kahlo requested. She just spoke honestly about herself. By doing this, you revealed the reality to millions of people who had never previously seen themselves represented in art. We see courage now when we look at her face. Color is visible to us. Resistance is evident. We regard Frida as immortal rather than dead.